holographic display flickered with numbers that would make any sane being reach for the nearest intoxicant. Admiral Vashi stared at the statistics floating before him, his four eyes twitching in what could only be described as administrative horror. 89% dropout rate, he announced to the assembled board members, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 poor decisions. 89%, General Kraftnog. That means for every 100 cadets we send to that accursed planet, 11 come back. And that's if we're lucky. General Kraftnog, a massive Coraxian whose exoskeleton had seen better centuries, clicked his mandibles in what passed for a laugh among his species. Oh, it gets better, Admiral. Of those 11 who return, 6 require immediate psychological rehabilitation, 3 refuse to speak about their experiences, and 2, he paused for dramatic effect, 2 actually request to go back. Request to go back. Admiral Vashi's tentacles writhed in disbelief. To Earth, that gravity-cursed death trap where the locals call running 20 kilometers a warm-up. The very same, Kraftnog confirmed, shuffling through his data tablets, with claws that could slice through battle armor. But here's the truly insane part. We have another volunteer. The silence in the chamber was so complete you could hear Admiral Drawhorn's breathing apparatus, wheezing in the corner. The Zalithian had been suspiciously quiet, which usually meant he was either plotting something or calculating odds. Please tell me you're joking, Vashi muttered, though he knew better. The universe had a twisted sense of humor when it came to military logistics. Cadet Zara-Keth of Altair Prime. Kraftnog read from his tablet, his mandibles clicking faster now. 23 standard years old, graduated middle of her class from basic training, and apparently possesses what her psychological profile delicately terms excessive determination bordering on pathological stubbornness. Admiral Drawhorn finally spoke up, his mechanical voice crackling through his translation unit. I'll give 3-to-1 odds she doesn't last the first week. 5-to-1 she requests evacuation within 48 hours. What makes this one think she's different? Vashi asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Kraftnog's exoskeleton rattled with what might have been amusement. According to her application, and I quote, "If those insane humans can do it, how hard could it possibly be?" The collective groan that echoed through the chamber could have powered a small starship. Famous last words. Drawhorn wheezed, already calculating his betting pools. I'm taking bets on cause of evacuation. Psychological breakdown is currently the favorite at 2-to-1. Commander Tom Marley stood before the assembled group of what could generously be called volunteers, though sentient beings with questionable life choices would have been more accurate. His scarred face bore the expression of someone who had delivered this speech far too many times to far too many species who thought they knew better. Right then, future casualties, he began, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of a funeral director. Welcome to the pre-departure briefing for Earth Training Program Designation Omega-7 Death Wish. I'm Commander Marley, and I'll be your guide through what we optimistically call informed consent. A nervous Vorthan in the front row raised 3 of his arms. Commander, is it true that Earth's gravity is... Let me stop you there, Cadet, Marley interrupted. Yes, everything you've heard is true. Yes, it's worse than you think. No, we're not exaggerating for dramatic effect. Earth's gravity will crush your bones. Their oxygen concentration will burn your lungs, and their training regimen was apparently designed by sadistic lunatics who consider pain a learning opportunity. Quartermaster wheeled in a cart loaded with equipment that looked more like torture devices than survival gear. The grizzled Nexarian's mechanical arm clicked as he began sorting through the items with practiced indifference. Standard issue survival kit, announced, his artificial voice box crackling. Gravity compensation harness, rated for approximately, let's see, not nearly enough. Oxygen filtration system, guaranteed to work until it doesn't. Emergency beacon, because when you inevitably break down crying, we'll need to find you for evacuation. Several cadets exchanged worried glances. A Cathari female near the back began hyperventilating, her gills fluttering rapidly. I think I've made a terrible mistake. That's the spirit, I cackled, tossing her a breathing apparatus. Self-awareness is the first step towards survival, or at least a dignified death. While panic began spreading through the group like a particularly virulent disease, Cadet Zara-Keth sat calmly examining her datapad, occasionally making notes. Her casual attitude was driving everyone absolutely insane. "Cadet Keth," Marley called out, his patience wearing thin. "Do you have any questions about the mortality statistics I just shared?" Zara-Keth looked up with the sort of bland expression that made superior officers contemplate early retirement. "Not really, sir. I was just reading about human recreational activities. Apparently they voluntarily jump off perfectly safe cliffs with nothing but fabric wings for entertainment." The silence that followed was broken only by someone's quiet sobbing. Transport Captain Judge Quintara chose that moment to make her entrance, her cybernetic implants humming softly as she surveyed the group of soon-to-be traumatized cadets. "Listen up, meat packages," she announced cheerfully. "I've been running transport to Earth for 15 standard years, and I've seen things that would make a void wraith request therapy. Humans don't just survive in conditions that kill other species, they thrive in them. They exercise for fun, eat food that could strip hull plating, and their idea of relaxation involves activities that would constitute war crimes on most civilized worlds." She paused to let that sink in. "Any questions before we begin your descent into beautiful, horrifying madness?" The transport shuttle touched down on Earth's surface with all the gentleness of a meteor impact, which seemed oddly appropriate given what awaited them. Through the viewport, Zara-Keth could see a landscape that looked deceptively pleasant, all green vegetation and blue skies, like a tourist brochure for a vacation destination rather than a military training nightmare. "Remember," Judge Quintara called from the pilot's seat, "the atmosphere won't kill you immediately, but everything else might. Try not to embarrass your respective species too badly." The shuttle doors hissed open, and immediately the gravity hit them like a physical blow. Several cadets collapsed instantly, their exoskeletons creaking under the crushing weight of Earth's relentless pull. The Cathari female from the briefing made a sound somewhere between a wheeze and a death rattle. "Oh, come on now," a cheerful human voice called out. "It's not that bad, you're still breathing, aren't you?" Zara-Keth looked up from where she was struggling to maintain her balance, and felt her blood vessels constrict in species-appropriate terror. A human female was approaching them, and she was smiling, actually smiling, with those predator teeth gleaming in the sunlight like she was genuinely happy to see them. "Welcome to Earth Training Facility Delta 7, the human announced with the sort of enthusiasm typically reserved for announcing lottery winners or successful evacuations. "I'm Instructor Amy Kowalski, and I'll be your guide through what we like to call character building, but what you'll probably call cruel and unusual punishment. But hey, that's just semantics." An Exurian cadet raised one trembling mechanical appendage. "Instructor, perhaps we could have a brief adjustment period." "Adjustment period?" Amy laughed, a sound that somehow managed to be both musical and terrifying. "Oh, that's adorable. No, we're going to start with a little welcome jog. Just 5 kilometers to get the blood flowing." The collective groan from the cadets could have powered a small city. 5 kilometers, gasped the Vorthan, who had asked questions during the briefing. "In this gravity? That's physically impossible for most carbon-based life forms." "Well," Amy said, tilting her head in a gesture that would have been cute if it weren't coming from a creature capable of jogging 5 kilometers for fun, "I guess we'll find out who's most carbon-based, won't we?" Zara-Keth felt her legs trembling under the increased gravitational load, her Altairian physiology screaming in protest at every movement. Her species had evolved on a low-gravity world where grace and agility mattered more than brute strength. Here she felt like she was wearing a suit made of neutronium. But as she watched 2 cadets already signaling for emergency evacuation, and a third curled up in what appeared to be a catatonic state, something stubborn flared in her chest. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stupidity. Maybe there wasn't much difference between the two. "Instructor Kowalski," she managed, forcing herself to stand upright despite feeling like her spine was about to compress into a singularity. "When do we start?" Amy's smile somehow became even more terrifying. "Oh, I like you already. What's your name, cadet?" "Zara-Keth of Altair Prime, ma'am." "Zara-Keth." Amy repeated, as if she were tasting the name. Well, Zara-Keth, we start now. Everyone who can still move, fall in behind me. Everyone who can't, well... She gestured toward the emergency beacon station that had been thoughtfully placed just outside the shuttle landing pad. Judge Quintara will be happy to give you a ride home. As Amy began jogging at what she probably considered a gentle pace but looked to everyone else like a superhuman feat of endurance, Zara-Keth forced her protesting legs to follow. Behind them she could hear the distinctive whine of emergency beacons activating. This is just the warm-up, Amy called back cheerfully. Wait until you see what we've got planned for this afternoon. By day 3, the original group of 27 cadets had been reduced to 12, and the remaining survivors were beginning to understand why the Earth program had such a stellar reputation for producing either elite soldiers or psychological wrecks. The daily routine was, in Zara-Keth's opinion, clearly designed by beings who had confused training with elaborate torture. Morning began at what humans cheerfully called 500 hours, with a 10-kilometer run through terrain that seemed specifically chosen for its ability to inflict maximum suffering. This was followed by what Amy optimistically termed basic calisthenics, which involved movements that defied several known laws of physics and at least one law of common sense. Come on, people, Amy shouted as the remaining cadets struggled through their third set of what humans called burpees, but what felt more like ritualized suicide attempts. You're only competing against yourselves, and gravity, and your own species' evolutionary limitation. Zara-Keth's muscles screamed in languages she didn't know her nervous system was capable of speaking, but she gritted her teeth and continued. Around her, other cadets were dropping like their life support systems had malfunctioned. A Coraxian whose exoskeleton had developed stress fractures was making whimpering sounds that roughly translated to, "Why did I volunteer for this nightmare?" The real revelation came during combat training, when Amy introduced what she called a little help to keep things fair. The help turned out to be a human trainee named Brandon Torres, who was apparently participating in some sort of cultural exchange program. Brandon here is fresh out of basic training himself, Amy explained as the young human stepped forward with the sort of casual confidence that made predators rethink their life choices. He'll be demonstrating proper technique and maybe providing a little friendly competition. What followed could only be described as a masterclass in why humans were considered the galaxy's most inadvisable opponents in hand-to-hand combat. Brandon moved through the combat course like gravity was merely a suggestion, and physics was more of a guideline than an actual law. He completed the obstacle course in half the time of the fastest alien, then offered to do it again just to make sure he'd done it right. "Is he enhanced?" whispered a Zelithian cadet, whose breathing apparatus was working overtime. "Enhanced?" Amy laughed. "Oh honey, no. Brandon's completely baseline human. He just played varsity soccer in high school." The silence that followed was the kind typically reserved for moments of profound existential crisis. Things got worse, much worse, when Amy made an announcement that would later be remembered as the day hope died. "All right everyone," she said with the sort of smile that belonged in psychological warfare manuals, "I've got some exciting news. Next week we're starting Hell Week." The collective sound of despair from the remaining cadets could have been heard from orbit. "Hell Week?" Zara-Keth managed to ask, though part of her really didn't want to know the answer. "Oh, it's wonderful," Amy beamed. 72 hours of continuous training with minimal sleep, maximum stress and plenty of opportunities to find out what you're really made of. It's like regular training, but concentrated into pure, undiluted character development. That evening, emergency evacuation requests flooded the communication center. By morning, only 7 cadets remained, and 3 of those were seriously reconsidering their life choices. But something strange was happening to Zara-Keth. While her body felt like it had been disassembled and reassembled by enthusiastic amateurs, her mind was adapting. She was beginning to understand something fundamental about human psychology that the rest of the galaxy seemed to miss. Humans didn't just endure suffering, they embraced it. They turned pain into progress and obstacles into opportunities. They had somehow evolved to find joy in activities that would constitute war crimes on most civilized worlds. And despite herself, despite every rational thought screaming that this was insane, Zara-Keth was beginning to see the appeal. As she watched Brandon effortlessly complete another set of exercises that should have been physically impossible, she felt something she hadn't expected. Respect. Not fear, not horror, but genuine admiration for the sheer bloody-minded determination that seemed to be encoded in human DNA. "You know what?" she muttered to herself as she forced her protesting body through another round of burpees. "If these lunatics can do this for fun, maybe I can do it to survive." It was, she would later realize, the moment she stopped being an Altairian cadet and started becoming something else entirely. Dr. Moran's office was a stark contrast to the chaos of the training grounds, all soft lighting and comfortable furniture that seemed specifically designed to lull traumatized cadets into a false sense of security. The human psychologist sat across from Zara-Keth with a sort of calm demeanor that suggested either profound wisdom or complete detachment from reality. "So," Dr. Moran began, glancing at her tablet with the casual interest of someone discussing weather patterns rather than psychological breakdown statistics. "You're the Altairian who's still here. That's unusual." Zara-Keth shifted in her chair, still feeling the burn from that morning's light cardiovascular work, which had involved carrying 50-kilogram packs up a mountain that Brandon Torres had cheerfully informed them was just a hill really. "I suppose it is, Doctor. The others of your species typically request evacuation by day 2, Moran continued, making notes with the efficiency of someone who had conducted this conversation far too many times. "Your psychological profile indicates you should have followed that pattern. So, what's different about you?" Zara-Keth considered the question while rubbing her aching shoulders. "I'm starting to think your species is completely insane, but in a way that actually makes sense." Dr. Moran's eyebrows rose with genuine interest. "Elaborate on that, please." "Well," Zara-Keth began, trying to organize thoughts that had been scrambled by a week of impossible physical demands. "Most species view pain as a signal to stop. Humans seem to view it as a signal to push harder. It's like you've evolved to find suffering motivational." Moran nodded, setting down her tablet. "You're beginning to understand what we call resilience. But it's more than that. Humans have developed several psychological frameworks that might seem counterintuitive to other species. There's resilience, yes, but also spite. Spite? The ability to continue purely because someone told you that you couldn't. It's remarkably powerful. Brandon mentioned you asked him yesterday why humans put themselves through this voluntarily." Zara-Keth winced at the memory. He said, and I quote, "Because they said I couldn't." Then he did 50 more push-ups just to prove the point. Dr. Moran laughed, a sound that somehow managed to be both professional and genuinely amused. "That's textbook human psychology right there. We have this peculiar tendency to view obstacles not as barriers, but as challenges to our competence. Someone says something is impossible, and our immediate response is to prove them wrong, often at considerable personal cost." Something clicked in Zara-Keth's mind, a piece of understanding that had been lurking just out of reach. "So when everyone said Earth training would break me, you started wanting to prove them wrong," Moran finished. "Classic human thinking pattern. The question is, are you adopting our psychological frameworks because they're useful, or because you're developing them naturally?" Zara-Keth was quiet for a long moment, thinking about her homeworld. Altair Prime was a place of grace and efficiency, where her stockier build and stubborn personality had marked her as somehow defective. The Altairian ideal was flowing movement and elegant solutions, not the brute force determination that seemed to define human achievement. "On my homeworld," she said slowly, "I was considered weak, too solid, too stubborn, too willing to push through problems instead of finding clever ways around them. My instructors said I lacked the proper Altairian temperament for military service. And how does that feel now?" Zara-Keth thought about the morning's training, about the moment when she had realized she was no longer just enduring the pain but actually seeking it out as a measure of progress. Like maybe I was never meant to be Altairian in the first place. It was a revelation that hit her like physical impact, All her life she had been trying to fit into a mold that was fundamentally wrong for her psychology. But here, surrounded by humans who turned suffering into strength and obstacles into opportunities, she was beginning to understand what she actually was. "Dr. Moran," she said, her voice carrying a new certainty that surprised them both. "I don't want to just survive this program anymore." "Oh? What do you want?" Zara-Keth thought about Admiral Drahorn's betting pool, about all the species who had declared Earth training impossible, about every instructor on Altair Prime who had told her she wasn't quite right for military service. "I want to excel. I want to graduate at the top of the class. I want to go back to the Galactic Academy and show them what happens when someone tells me I can't do something." Dr. Moran smiled, and for the first time since arriving on Earth, Zara-Keth found a human expression genuinely comforting rather than terrifying. "Now that," the psychologist said, making final notes in her file, "sounds like properly human thinking. Welcome to the species, Cadet Keth. I think you're going to fit right in." As Zara-Keth left the office, she realized something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer an Altairian trying to survive human training. She was becoming something new entirely, something that could take the best of both worlds and forge them into something stronger than either alone. 3 months into the program, Zara-Keth stood at the edge of the obstacle course, watching a fresh batch of cadets experience their first taste of Earth training. Their expressions of terror and disbelief were so familiar she almost felt nostalgic, which was probably the most human emotion she had ever experienced. "Remember," she called out to a trembling Nexarian, who was staring at the rope climb like it had personally insulted his ancestors, "the rope isn't your enemy. Gravity is your enemy. The rope is just gravity's accomplice." The Nexarian's mechanical appendages twitched in what might have been appreciation for the advice or preparation for emergency evacuation. It was difficult to tell with their species. Emmy Kowalski jogged up beside her, barely breathing hard despite having just completed what she euphemistically called a morning constitutional, but what everyone else recognized as a 20-kilometer run through terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. "Look at you," Amy said with the sort of pride typically reserved for parents watching their offspring take first steps, dispensing wisdom to the newcomers. "I remember when you could barely stand up in our gravity." Zara-Keth flexed experimentally, still amazed at what her body had become. Her Altairian physiology had responded to the constant stress in ways that would have fascinated xenobiologists and terrified her former instructors. Her muscle density had increased dramatically, her cardiovascular system had adapted to Earth's oxygen concentration, and her bone structure had literally reinforced itself to handle the crushing gravitational load. But the physical changes were nothing compared to the mental evolution. She now approached problems with what Dr. Moran had termed aggressive optimism, the peculiarly human belief that any obstacle could be overcome through sufficient application of stubborn determination and creative profanity. "Zara-Keth," Brandon Torres called from across the training ground, where he was demonstrating proper technique for what humans had inexplicably named burpees, to a group of cadets who looked like they were contemplating the various ways their life insurance policies might pay out. Ready for round 2. Their daily competition had become something of a legend among the training staff. What had started as Brandon casually mentioning that he bet he could do more pull-ups than the alien girl had evolved into increasingly ridiculous challenges that pushed both of them to their limits. "What's today's death wish?" Zara-Keth asked, jogging over with the easy stride that had taken months of painful adaptation to develop. Brandon grinned, an expression that would have terrified her months ago but now just indicated he had thought of something particularly stupid to attempt. "Weighted pack run to checkpoint 7 and back. Last one to finish buys drinks at the cantina. How much weight?" 40 kilos each. Zara-Keth considered this. Checkpoint 7 was 15 kilometers away through terrain that included 2 steep hills, a river crossing, and what Amy cheerfully called the section where people usually question their life choices. With 40 kilograms of additional weight, in Earth gravity, it would be absolutely brutal. "You're on?" she said without hesitation. The watching cadets made sounds of disbelief in 17 different languages, several of which roughly translated to, Has everyone on this planet lost their minds? As they prepared for the run, Zara-Keth caught sight of herself in the reflection of a nearby window and had to do a double take. The alien looking back at her bore only passing resemblance to the cadet who had arrived months ago. Her frame had filled out with muscle, her posture radiated confidence rather than stubborn determination, and her eyes held the particular gleam that came from discovering you were capable of far more than anyone, including yourself, had ever imagined. Representative from the Coraxian embassy here to see the Altairian cadet, announced Quartermaster A, his mechanical voice carrying its usual tone of mild amusement at the universe's capacity for producing absurd situations. A distinguished Coraxian in diplomatic robes approached, his mandibles clicking in what Zara-Keth had learned to recognize as barely contained horror. Behind him trailed what appeared to be an entire delegation of various species, all wearing expressions of scientific fascination mixed with existential dread. Cadet Zara-Keth, the Coraxian began formally. I am Ambassador Veltak. We have come to observe what the Galactic Military Academy describes as unprecedented adaptive development in non-human physiology. Oh, Zara-Keth said, shouldering her weighted pack. You mean because I haven't died yet? The ambassador's exoskeleton rattled slightly. Your performance reports indicate you are now outperforming baseline humans in several categories. This is theoretically impossible. Brandon laughed as he adjusted his own pack. Impossible? Dude, you should see her on the obstacle course. She's faster than half my squad from back home. The collective gasp from the delegation could have powered a small fusion reactor. Amy Kowalski chose that moment to make her entrance, practically glowing with instructor pride. Oh, you haven't seen anything yet. Show them the thing, Zara-Keth. Which thing? The wall climb. The vertical one. Zara-Keth glanced at the 3-meter vertical wall that had been the bane of her existence during her first week. Now she approached it at a sprint, hit it at full speed and went up and over in one fluid motion that would have made her former Altairian instructors weep with confusion. The delegation stood in stunned silence. How is this possible? Ambassador Veltak finally managed. Amy's grin was radiant. Simple. We broke her down completely, then built her back up using human psychology and spite. Works every time. Ready? Brandon asked, bouncing on his toes like the run ahead was a pleasant afternoon stroll rather than an endurance trial that would hospitalize most sentient beings. Always, Zara-Keth replied, and meant it completely. The 72-hour survival scenario was designed to break even the most resilient cadets. Dropped into Earth's wilderness with minimal equipment, no food, and terrain that seemed personally offended by the concept of easy navigation, it was the final test that separated the survivors from the legends. Zara-Keth crouched beside a stream she had located using techniques that would have seemed like magic to her former self, methodically preparing a shelter that could withstand the approaching storm. Around her, the Earth wilderness hummed with the sort of casual hostility that had driven most species to declare the planet uninhabitable for anything but the most extreme military training. Hour 18 found her not just surviving, but actually enjoying herself. This realization hit her with the force of a small meteor. She was having fun, in conditions that would constitute a war crime on most civilized worlds. She was genuinely enjoying the challenge. Day 1, final log entry, she spoke into her recording device. Her voice steady despite having been awake for nearly 20 hours. Current status, hydrated, sheltered and apparently developing the same psychological disorders that make humans think this is entertaining. I have successfully trapped 3 fish, constructed a weatherproof shelter, and started a fire using techniques I learned from watching Brandon Torres demonstrate camping skills last month. She paused, watching rain begin to fall on her carefully constructed lean-to. Personal note, I can't stop thinking about how terrified I was when I first arrived here. That cadet who could barely walk in Earth gravity feels like a different person entirely. Maybe she was. By hour 48 she had not only met all survival requirements but had constructed what could generously be termed a temporary settlement, complete with multiple food sources, water purification system, and defensive positions that demonstrated a thorough understanding of both human tactical doctrine and pure bloody-minded determination. The monitoring team was beginning to sound concerned over the radio. Cadet Keth, your vital signs indicate you're not just surviving the scenario, you're thriving in it. Is your equipment functioning properly? Equipment is fine, she responded, pausing in her construction of what appeared to be a primitive but effective hunting trap. Just applying everything I've learned about human problem-solving approaches, which is, if something is trying to kill you, kill it back, but more efficiently. The silence that followed was broken only by what sounded like someone dropping their coffee. Hour 72 arrived with Zara-Keth having not only survived, but having created what the monitoring team's report would later describe as a small but functional military outpost, featuring defensive positions, sustainable food sources, and what appeared to be the beginnings of a permanent settlement. The graduation ceremony took place 3 days later in the Academy's main amphitheater, with an audience that included most of the Galactic Military Academy's senior command structure. Admiral Vashi sat in the front row, his 4 eyes twitching in what appeared to be barely controlled disbelief. "Ladies, gentlemen, and assorted sentient beings," Amy Kowalski announced from the podium, her voice carrying the pride of an instructor who had accomplished something theoretically impossible. "I present the first non-human graduate of Earth Training Program Omega-7, Cadet Zara-Keth of Altair Prime." The applause was polite but confused, as if the audience wasn't quite sure what they were witnessing. General Krafnog leaned over to Admiral Vashi, his mandibles clicking rapidly. "The performance reports can't be accurate. No non-human has ever completed the full program, let alone with honors." Admiral Vashi's tentacles writhed as he reviewed the data tablet in his hands. According to this, she not only completed every requirement but exceeded baseline human performance standards in 14 categories. That's not supposed to be possible. As Zara-Keth stepped forward to receive her graduation certification, she caught sight of her reflection in the polished floor of the amphitheater. The being looking back at her bore almost no resemblance to the nervous cadet who had volunteered for this program months ago. This was someone who had been forged in Earth's gravity and tempered by human psychology until she had become something entirely new. "Congratulations, Graduate Keth," Amy said, handing her the certificate with the sort of smile that suggested she was already planning even more impossible challenges for future cadets. "Thank you, Instructor Kowalski. This has been educational." "Educational," Amy laughed. "That's one way to put it." Admiral Drahorn approached as the ceremony concluded, his mechanical breathing apparatus working overtime. "Graduate Keth, I need to inform you that your performance has created something of a bureaucratic situation." "Sir?" "Your physical and psychological profile now classifies you as a Class 7 combat specialist. That's the same rating we give to enhanced human special forces operatives. Several departments are expressing concern about deploying you to, shall we say, more diplomatically sensitive assignments." Zara-Keth processed this information with the sort of calm analysis that months of impossible challenges had trained into her. "Are you saying I'm too dangerous for normal military service?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Drahorn wheezed. "Congratulations. You've become what humans would call overpowered for standard operations." The irony was so perfect it could have been scripted by someone with a twisted sense of humor. She had come to Earth to prove she could survive human training, and instead had become too human for her own species' comfort. 6 months later, Instructor Zara-Keth stood before a classroom of wide-eyed cadets at the Galactic Military Academy, their expressions ranging from awe to terror to what appeared to be existential confusion. Behind her, a holographic display showed training footage from Earth that made several species in the audience question their life choices. "Who can tell me?" she began, her voice carrying the particular tone that instructors developed when they were about to ruin someone's day. "What the previous dropout rate was for Earth Training Program Omega-7. A nervous Vorthan in the front row raised 3 arms tentatively. 89% Instructor. 89%, Zara-Keth confirmed. "And what is the current waiting list for the program?" The silence was deafening. 347 applicants, she announced, watching as several cadets made small sounds of disbelief. From 72 different species, the same program that was once considered a death sentence is now the most requested advanced training in the galaxy. Admiral Vashi, observing from the back of the classroom, shook his head in bewilderment. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. What had once been the Galactic Military's most expensive mistake had become its most prestigious program, largely because one stubborn Altairian had refused to accept that something was impossible. Instructor Keth called out a Coraxian cadet, whose exoskeleton was already showing stress patterns from the mere thought of Earth training. Is it true that you now outperform baseline humans in combat assessments? Zara-Keth's smile held the particular edge that came from having survived things that weren't supposed to be survivable. Last month, I was invited to participate in a cross-training exercise with human special forces. The results were educational. Educational how? I won, she said simply. Twice. The collective gasp could have powered a small starship. In the hallway outside, General Kraftnog was having what could charitably be called a philosophical crisis. We created a monster, Vashi. An actual monster. She's now training other species to be like her, and they're volunteering for it. Admiral Vashi's tentacles writhed in what might have been amusement or horror. The Zalithian High Command sent a formal request last week asking if we could design an Earth-style training program for their home system. The same species that once declared human training methods a violation of sapient rights now wants to implement them. What did you tell them? I referred them to Instructor Keth. She's designing a modified curriculum. Modified how? Apparently she's making it harder. They stood in comfortable silence, watching through the classroom window as Zara-Keth demonstrated something she called human-style problem-solving to her increasingly terrified students. You know, Kraftnog mused, I think we fundamentally misunderstood what the Earth program was supposed to accomplish. How so? We thought it was designed to break cadets down and rebuild them as soldiers, but that's not what it does at all. Vashi's eyes focused on his colleague. Then what does it do? It teaches them to think like humans. And humans, as it turns out, don't have a concept of impossible, they just have difficult and requires more creativity. Inside the classroom, a cadet raised her hand. Instructor, in your opinion, what's the most important lesson from Earth training? Zara-Keth paused, considering the question with the sort of thoughtful expression that had become her trademark since returning from that gravity-cursed planet. The most important lesson, she said finally, is that Earth doesn't break you. It makes you. Everything that everyone told me was impossible about that program was absolutely true. The gravity will crush you, the training will destroy you, and the psychological pressure will reduce you to your component atoms. The classroom was so quiet you could hear breathing apparatus functioning. But here's what they didn't tell me, she continued, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had stared into the abyss and decided to redecorate it. After Earth breaks you down completely, it builds you back up using human psychology, and human psychology is apparently contagious. She gestured to the training footage still playing behind her, showing humans casually accomplishing feats that violated several laws of physics and at least one law of common sense. They don't just train you to survive impossible conditions, they train you to find impossible conditions entertaining. And once you start thinking like that, the word impossible becomes just another word for challenge accepted. A Nexarian in the back row made a sound that roughly translated to, why would anyone volunteer for this madness? Zara-Keth's grin was absolutely radiant, because someone told them they couldn't do it. And if there's one thing I learned from humans, it's that telling them something is impossible is just inviting them to prove you wrong in the most dramatic way possible. She looked out at the sea of terrified faces and felt something that could only be described as instructor's pride. Applications for next semester's Earth program are due Friday. Class dismissed. As the cadets filed out, several already muttering about application deadlines, Admiral Vashi realized something profound. They hadn't just accidentally created a super soldier, they had accidentally figured out how to mass-produce them. The universe, he reflected, was about to become a much more interesting place,